Good morning. This lecture is on biblical anthropology. The term anthropology here simply means like an understanding of the study of the human person. And there's different approaches to this. You can do a philosophical anthropology, a physiological anthropology. We can do a biblical anthropology. We can do an anthropology sort of predicated on natural law and such. So there's different ways to do it. This particular lecture is how we can simply look at sacred scripture and then from that have some sort of understanding of the human person. You know, we're all human, and it should be obvious that if somebody were to ask us what it means to be human, that we could explain that. But we're often, sort of left hanging when we try to explain those things that are most common. Again, this is true for all terms. I've said before, we don't always understand the actual meaning of the word justice or beauty and such. Anyway, the ancients often had, especially through Aristotle and picked up by Aquinas, an understanding of what a thing is, so the nature of a thing, by talking about its causes. Now, when we hear the word cause, we think like what made something happen. Well, that's only one of the causes according to the ancients. So if you can like imagine a pen, we call this thing a pen, but there are different ways that we can talk about what caused this pen to come into existence, to be, we would say. We could talk about the material it's made of. It's made of, plastic and maybe a metal spring and some ink and such, or perhaps rubber. And all those things are the cause. We can talk in terms of the form. This is the idea that someone had of it. Different pens have different shapes and different ways that they fit into our hand and such. We could also talk about the efficient cause, and the efficient cause is exactly who made it. So we might say Bic, or perhaps, not the brand, but the individual themselves that made it. And we could also talk about the final cause. The final cause of a pen, it's a writing instrument, so it's to make marks on a light or smooth surface. So there we have the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and also the final cause. Most of the modern world just understands causes by the efficient cause. That's like what made the thing come into being. So the idea of a thing having in nature, what we would call essences, that's also something that gets, how do you want to say, contradicted in our modern times. We like to think that we give these things an essence. In other words, we construct what the thing is, and then we name it according to what we construct it, meaning that we can change that. So anyway, the argument here within Christianity is that the human person has, this material cause, what we're made of. We have this formal cause, perhaps the soul. We have the efficient cause, made in God's image, and then the final cause is obviously to be with God again in, after this life. So we're going to try to get to the bottom of what this means to be a human person, and we're going to not reduce it just down to the biological understanding of the human person, what we call the material understanding of the human person. We share 99% of the DNA with chimpanzees, and that sounds, it is remarkable, but it could give us the false impression that we are 99% like chimpanzees. Even if that were true, think of what that 1% would change, because the difference between us and chimpanzees is the Sistine Chapel, Led Zeppelin, pro football, all those things. So there are really tens of thousands of structural changes that occur within those DNA. So we get sort of a misrepresentation of exactly the significance of that. You can look this up, and I think Kevin Leyland wrote Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, how the culture made the human mind. This small percentage difference, translates into all those structural changes on a genetic level. Nonetheless, there are essential differences, so we are not confused as to who is a chimpanzee and who is a human being. So we're going to make the case that we have this human nature. We're going to sort of make that claim against this postmodern world that we live in, where the human nature is simply a social construct or such. So we can change, but we change in the way that our virtue is and our behavior is. But we're going to hold that we can't change in the way that our nature is. And we're going to go one step further and make the claim that this nature is attached to a meaning. In other words, by understanding this nature, we understand something about ourselves. That's we'll have to build that out a little bit. So rather than discovering just the design of a human person and determining in essence it's constructed, here we're going to talk about what is universal to the human person. By that I mean the universal nature of the human person as an essence, whether we're talking about a human person in 500 BC, 1000 AD, 2020 AD, or if we're looking at 5000 AD. It really doesn't matter. So we're not just going to get into how the culture changes our psychology and such. We're trying to get to the bottom of something. Before I do that, I've already offered you a definition of a sign. Let me say it again. It's represents something other than itself to a knowing power. Now I want to give you a few different takes on that. A token, an icon, and an idol are all types of signs. A token, it does not embody what it represents, and it doesn't have the ability to point to a reality beyond itself. So think of like a wedding ring. A wedding ring is a symbol, so it's a sign. It represents something other than itself to a knowing power. We have to know that it represents, a marriage covenant, but it doesn't embody the marriage. It'd be like if you were to give flowers or gifts to somebody that you love. It doesn't embody your love. It's a token of your love. So it reminds a person of a particular moment, place, or such, or maybe even another person. An icon. Now, an icon and an idol differ significantly from a token in the sense that they both embody what they represent. So an icon embodies what it represents, but it also points to the reality beyond itself. So love between two people within Christian marriage is an icon. It embodies marriage itself, but it also points to something else, greater the love of God. So we could even perhaps to some degree say like that, photos, like icons, typically in the Eastern churches, that they embody what they represent. But the icon of Christ or the icon of Mary or any other saint, it points to the actual thing that it represents. So we recognize that if I'm looking at an icon photo of Christ, that it's not Christ, but it embodies this notion and then points beyond itself to the Christ. An idol, on the other hand, still is a sign and it does embody what it represents, but it does not point outside of itself. So we would use a phrase perhaps like it absorbs the gaze, right? So in other words, it's almost as if, think in the Old Testament, the golden calf. So when the golden calf was built, it embodied what it represents, but it also absorbed the gaze of those who worshipped it. It never pointed beyond itself. So that's the significant difference between an idol and an icon. An icon points beyond itself to the original. The idol absorbs the gaze and does not allow anything beyond it to move. So in this place, God could not, we do not want to be idols, I should say. In other words, as human beings, the nature of the human person, we want to point beyond ourselves, which would be an icon. If we were self-absorbed, might be a way that we can say, or we try to take credit for all those things that are gifts given to us, as far as gifts given to us in the presence of the human person, then we would say, well, that would be making an idol of ourselves. Okay. So now what I just want to do is I want to walk through, at least, even though that it might appear systematic, I want to walk through various features of the idea of each of us being made in God's image. So if we're going to say, as Scripture does, that the human person is made imago Dei, in the image of God, what does that really mean? So what is it that God has as characteristics that we share in those, unlike all of other creation, which we are, quite frankly, still part of? When we talk about rationality, rationality is the ability to reason, so we do. Now, we might think that other animals have some of this ability, but let's leave that for a minute. The difference between us and animals is that we're not slaves to our instincts. Animals will do that which an animal does. So if an animal has an accident in the house because it didn't go outside to go to the bathroom, we might say bad dog, but we don't mean that. The dog is just simply doing what it does. We have the ability to reason. So we have control over our passions, over our intellect, over our sexuality, all of those things. So even though sex and food are both things that we need, we can control those. And if we don't control those, then there's some issue between our rationality and our desire for those things. So we bring reason to bear. And this is what allows us to rise above the brute. The human person, we're also self-aware. Not only, do we know that we know that we're human. Does a dog know that it's a dog? That type of thing. We can also abstract. And by abstract, I don't mean like confuse. We're able to take something from one thing and put it onto another. So let me say this. We understand what a horse is, and we understand what a narwhal is, but we can abstract the horn off the narwhal and put it onto the horse and have this mythical understanding of a unicorn. So that ability to abstract rather than to only see things in its concrete reality is also part of the gift of relationality, of rationality. Free will. We'll get into this further down the line in the course as to exactly how this works for people that are materialist. In other words, don't believe in anything immaterial. But for now, you see in the story, the mythos of the fall, that it would only be possible for that story to have any sort of, bite into having a truth unless, of course, Adam and Eve were to freely choose to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this is something that God himself possesses, and then us made in his image, we share. But I want to say two things about this, because freedom is often misunderstood in our modern world. In other words, when the average person thinks of freedom, they think that I'm allowed to do something. That's a freedom from. This is more like a liberty, but we use the term freedom. Now, this is important because many have died trying to provide this type of freedom for us and continue to do so. But if we leave it in those terms as a moral freedom, then freedom here becomes nothing more than autonomy. So freedom has to be more than just me wanting to do what I want to do. Because if that were the case, then anything that's imposed on me, I'm not allowed to eat that, I shouldn't do this with my body, then all of a sudden these seems like rules from the outside that are imposed on us, and they seem like they are an obstacle to our freedom, and that's why we spiritually and psychologically oppose those. So I want you to think of free will here in a different way. I want you to understand it in terms of, and here's the definition I can give you, doing that which we were designed to do. So real quick, go back to a pen. A pen is designed for writing on the surface of a piece of paper or such. Yes, I can dig out weeds between in the cracks between sidewalks. I could probably even try to scratch, a brick wall with it. That would destroy the pen. So, in a sense, I have the liberty to do those, right? This autonomy, but I'm not using it in the way that is designed. So, our human freedom is that same way. We want to do that which we were designed to do. Well, what's happening here in this particular lecture is we're trying to figure out what our design is. So in a sense, all these attributes of us being made imago Dei are going to, we're going to be only as free to the point or to the extent that we align ourselves with those. Now we understand this again with foods, right? We understand that if you don't eat right, your body's not going to be healthy. And so we don't want to see that which we desire, which isn't healthy, as simply, an imposition on our freedom or an imposition on our health. We're trying to align ourselves up with what works with our physiology. If you want another example, and let's use Thomas the Tank Engine, because it's a train, engine that actually can talk. I think it does. Anyway, if Thomas is, riding on the rail tracks, and as it goes past various, locations, it sees like the beautiful hills and the trees. It might even be close enough to the shore where it sees like the ocean and the sand. And it's thinking to itself, I'm constrained. I'm only able to go on these rail tracks. So it asked Mr. Conductor, which is either George Carlin or Ringo Starr, I want to go up into the hills and the trees. So Ringo Starr places Thomas the Tank Engine up in the hill, and it soon realizes that it can't move. The ground's not hard enough. It can't negotiate in between trees. So it says, okay, well, how about if I try, down near the sand? So George Carlin picks it up and puts it down in the sand, and it just sinks in and realizes nothing's going to happen. Finally, it says, okay, fine, put me back in the railroad tracks, and off it goes. It realizes what seemed like its constraint, that it was only allowed to stay on the tracks. It turns out this is the only way that Thomas the Tank Engine could be free, because now it is doing that which it was designed to do. So that's the type of freedom that we're looking at here. Now, incarnate, we are not just a body and we are not just a soul. So a Judeo-Christian understanding of the human person is that we have this composite, not two things, but this psychosomatic union. So, like, for instance, we don't drive around inside of our bodies like the aliens did in Men in Black. And we also don't just simply say, well, it's what's on the inside that counts, right? Unless you're judging somebody superficially, then yes, then you shouldn't be doing that. Sometimes you might hear somebody say, you can't judge me by the outside because you can't judge a book by its cover. That's a little misleading, because that almost starts, well, it does start to insinuate that our bodies are just a cover for who we are. That's not true. The reality is that we are one composite being. So your parents, if they hold to any theistic belief and consider that you have a soul too, as in other words, you're not just a materialist, they don't refer to your body as, like, this is, I am the father or the mother of this body. They talk about you as a person. Now, they're not the originators of the soul, but they recognize that the soul and the body are part one. So I'm not trying to, be facetious, but, a parent doesn't just take credit for the body, because they realize that that's not the totality of the person. So we're incarnate. We're, composite beings. This as often gets missed by the modern world. We are not in relation with each other simply because, for safety reasons, although that is an advantage, or that we just like being around other people. When God said man should not be alone, I like how Dumas explains that this doesn't even just refer to this man's companionship with the woman, but it's the human person's companionship with all creation. Like in a really very real way. We share something with all creation. Now, this isn't a pantheism, right? This isn't that God is in all parts of nature. If you want the term, it's actually pantheism. In other words, God's presence could be found in all of creation. So anyway, this has to go a little bit farther than just the fact that, we need the other person. The reality is that if you want to think in terms of how we are built for relationality, think of language. Language is something that's innate within the human person. They used to think that it wasn't. We were born tabula rasa, in other words, a blank slate. But we're actually born and built for language. What is the purpose of language? To communicate. Well, if we weren't inherently relational, why would we have the ability, or at least, the inherent ability to communicate to others? If you want to go a little farther, you can't even really have thoughts without some sort of words. You can try it, right? But we have some sort of name for things. It might be true that we could look at something and a child might have a thought of something before it's even a word, but there's no way for us to share this with anybody else. So we need language for this. We're also going to have to talk a little bit about how this would even eventually work primarily for us in justice, right? Like, if justice compels us to do the good for all, I want you to start thinking in the back of your head how just that notion itself, how relational it is, because we recognize other people as another one of ourselves. They too are made in God's image. And by the way, let me just say something about this. This isn't something that comes to the Catholic at baptism. This isn't something that just Christians have. This is everybody is made in God's image, regardless of whether or not a person acquiesces to it or accepts it or something, to that degree. All right. The idea of contingency is that if you can imagine taking care of a pet, now some animals could live very well on their own, others could not, like a fit, like at least within captivity. A fish in a tank is entirely contingent on who it is that's taking care of it. Unless there's some built-in replicating, ecosystem, there's nothing for this fish to survive. We are not isolated from God. So there's this idea somehow that in the early founding fathers of the United States held this idea of like a watchmaker God. So they might have held that God created everything and he imbued all things with a particular nature, a physical nature, so that we can now study those. But it moves. It doesn't need him to move on. So it's like this distant God. So it's a watchmaker God. God wound his creation up at one point. Now he could sit back and allow it, like a watch, to move on its own. That's a very isolated view of the human person from their creator. So we're going to understand it in this terms, that without God and his breath to sustain us, we would all wither like say flowers without the sun. We are talking about body and soul. The ancient Israelites had a tripart understanding of the human person. So they had the body and the soul. They called it the basar and the nefesh. But there was a third thing called the ruha, and this was the spirit of God. So think of it like the breath of God. So it's almost like God's, and I know this is, an analogy, God's breath sustains us, and were he to withdraw it, we would wither, just like a flower to wither without sun. So it's an active relationship is where I'm trying to go. And contingency means that we're always contingent as creation on the Creator. Now, supernatural orientation. Remember I shared with you that I don't usually make a case of trying to offer explanations for the proof of God. But I like this one in the sense that I think it has some meaning towards that regard. You can use it as you'd like. If we're created in his image and in union with God, who's our source and desire and our ultimate good, this means that we're not temporal beings. In other words, we're not, we don't have a finite existence. Now, there's nothing in this world that will entirely satisfy us. It doesn't matter what bucket list we have and how well we fill that bucket. At the end of our life, we will be satisfied, but we will never be entirely satisfied. You can remember a little bit back, there was that acronym YOLO, you only live once. Well, not to trash that per se, but this supernatural orientation says, no, we don't only live once. So yes, enjoy life, but don't think you have to get it all in because this is all there is. That's a materialistic, atheistic understanding of it. So think about, any dissatisfaction that we have in life comes from this built-in desire. In other words, that's something that the temporal can't hold. In other words, it doesn't matter how big our houses are, how large our paychecks are, what fancy degrees we have, new cars, exotic vacations. All those things become idols because they start to embody rather than pointing to something outside of this. So the reality is that, depression and suicide rates often climb proportionally with material wealth. This tells us that maybe we're not oriented towards the natural. We're oriented towards the supernatural. So the reason why we don't find satisfaction here on earth in this temporal existence is because we're not made for this. So part of being made in God's image is to return to that God. Now I add this. We've already talked about the term liturgical, but I'm going to use it here as like a little bit of a combination of like interdependency, relationality, and hold us as a worshiping being. In other words, it is quite natural for us to sacrifice ourselves to others. Now that is something that God, the Creator, holds. He is the sacrificial God. We might say that he gifts himself to us. Well, if we are like this God, then we too are sacrificial, and we gift ourselves to others. if you think back to the story of Cain and Abel, so Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, they both brought sacrifices to God. Now, if you just read that, and remember I said if you could stop pretending that this is scripture for a minute and that you're reading a sacred text, read it like a story and ask a couple questions. And here, not the question is where did they come from or who did they marry. That's all good, but not here. It only says that in the course of time, Cain and Abel made their sacrificial offerings. Now, what's odd is there was no command. No one said to do it. Where did this come from? Was it just natural for them? Because still, even not after the fall, is it still natural for them just to gift themselves to other? I think that's how we are. We're sacrificial beings. We know not just how good it feels to give ourselves to other, but we know that this is part of something that we should do. So we can start to think three terms: sacrifice, love, and gift is all synonyms. So part of our nature is sacrifice, love, and gift. And that's who we are as human beings. All right, so, what we have here is we have just, a handful of attributes, and I just expanded on them a little bit to explain what does it mean, just from a biblical sense, that we as human persons are made in the image of God. So back to this token, this icon, and this idol. Remember that, we ourselves are to be made, or are to be these signs and symbols, right? In Andre Dumas's article, right, he talks about these Christian communities today. Like, we can't be nostalgic groups just wishing for the old days, and we're also not isolated individuals. We have to look towards the culmination of all things. The big term there is eschatology, this end times. But we never are going to have a perfect utopia here on earth. We never have perfect justice. It's something Augustine said. It's something Martin Luther King Jr. held. But we do want to help change the world. But the reality is that we start by changing ourselves, right? So we try our best to conform to this understanding of this dignity that we're made in God's image. And then what we want is we want to be these icons.